I'll tell you, I really don't believe that demon possession occurs anymore. But they have tried everything they can with these speakers, so I'm beginning to think that there's some other explanation. It is good to see everyone this evening. Good to have another time of worship and to stay together. I want to take just a moment before we get started to tag on to what Ray said in the announcements. We are so grateful for all the donations towards what we're going to be doing with the kiddos and the back to school thing. We've gotten so much for the books and for the water and just all the different things, and we're just really thankful for all of that and looking forward to that effort. I think, as we've already mentioned, we'll be handing out not those full-size flyers, but a little something out at the Wild and Free on the square, so hopefully that will get the word out as well, and hoping to reach as many kids and their families as possible. It's interesting that Tom addressed some of what he addressed this morning, because it leads very well into what we're going to talk about this evening. In particular, he mentioned some of the things that Jesus did that pointed to his mastery over nature, his mastery over the laws of nature. When you look in the book of Matthew, and this of course is reiterated in other of the Gospels, but in Matthew you have the full record, if you will, at least the fullest we have access to, of what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And we have Jesus going up on a mountain because, of course, they don't have microphones or speaker systems. And so he is up in a place where he can project his voice and people can hear him. And there's a great amount of people that can gather around him. And he is presenting them with a message that in many ways is unlike anything they've heard. Now, I would argue the basic principles that he teaches in this sermon, in this presentation, is or these principles are rather very much found in the Old Testament when we understand it correctly. But what had happened throughout the teachings of the Jewish leadership is that a lot of these things had been kind of either twisted or they had been, I guess, gutted of the true meaning, the underlying reasoning why they were to be done. And so a lot of what Jesus talks about turns their perception on their head and tells them that instead of going through the motions of what you're being told to do, you should think about the heart of the matter. You should think about the principles. You should understand that I am coming to teach a different way of looking at what God expects of you. That's the Sermon on the Mount. But I think sometimes we don't connect the Sermon on the Mount with what we're told happens immediately after. We're familiar with what happens immediately after, but we don't think about the fact that it happens immediately after. Because what happens as we move on to chapter 8 of the book of Matthew is that he comes down off the mountain after presenting these amazing teachings that leave the people in awe, and they just can't understand where this person came from, how he's teaching in this way. They're in absolute amazement. So he's coming down off the mountain. Everyone's naturally following after him. And lo and behold, guess who shows up? A leper. Now, you may have heard before, and it's an important point for us to consider, the word that we have in Scripture that refers to leprosy, both in the Old and the New Testament, it's not quite the same as the specific medical term leprosy that we use in English today. It would be included in that, but in Scripture, when we talk about leprosy, we're talking about a broad category of skin infectious diseases, some of which are much more dangerous and much more contagious than what technically in the medical field is called leprosy today. And so there's a reason, as we see throughout the Old Law, that these people were required to be removed from the rest of the congregation of Israel. This is a very serious, very debilitating disease that they are exposed to, and it can create an epidemic if they're not careful. But this leper, he knows that his situation can be different. He approaches Jesus, and we're told he kneels before him, and he says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretches out his hand and touches him and says, I am willing, be clean. And of course, immediately the leprosy is removed, the man is made whole. And Jesus tells him, don't tell anyone what just happened. Strange, considering there's a whole crowd there that just saw what happened, but we'll go back to that in a second. He says, instead, I want you to go to the priest, show yourself to him, because under the law of Moses, the priest would examine a leper who has been healed, or more likely, in most cases, a leper who has recovered, we might say. In this case, miraculous healing and not a natural recovery. The priest can declare him clean, and he offers what is required as an offering for what has happened. But I want us to think about some things from this short, simple text about what Jesus ultimately, I would argue, is teaching us by his actions here with this unnamed leper that approaches him just after his Sermon on the Mount. You might have seen there's a meme that came across my news feed when I was on Facebook the other day, and it has a homeless man sitting, in at the wall of some business or something like that, and a young woman comes by and sees him, and she says, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. You must be going through so much difficulty right now. I know what to do." And she rushes off. And you see her later in a cafe with two of her other friends drinking coffee. "Oh, we need to bring more awareness about homelessness. We need to tell people about this. Oh, this is awful. Oh, yes." And then it goes back to the homeless man, and suddenly he stands up. He says, "I'm cured." And of course, we know that's not how it works. Just talking about it accomplishes nothing. Now, I think it is important to bring awareness to the difficulties people are going through, but the point is, a lot of times, all we do is talk about something, but we don't actually take any steps to fix a problem. We just talk about it. Jesus talked about a lot of problems in the Sermon on the Mount. He talked about a lot of things that we are responsible to do, a lot of situations we face. It's no mistake that the very first thing that happens after Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount is he goes and puts his words into action. He goes and does something about the things he's just been talking about. And that in itself was meant, I believe, to be a lesson for these people he just taught. And because it's recorded for us as well. Jesus didn't just teach these things. Jesus lived them out. Jesus put his words into action. In fact, that was his main complaint with the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership. He says in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 3, they practice, or rather they preach, but they do not practice. We have this phrase even in English that comes, or even in our culture rather, that comes from that verse. We need to practice what we preach, right? Jesus said they preach, but they don't practice. He says in another passage, they bind these heavy burdens on people and they won't touch that burden with their finger. Jesus was the master, if we want to put it in that term, of practicing what he preached, of putting his words into action. And that's what James emphasizes. James, who most people think the author of the book of James was the physical brother of Jesus, of course, brother through Mary, not through God himself. But James says we are to be doers of the word, not hearers only. And you remember what he says? If we are hearers only, he says, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. It's so easy for us to feel like we're doing a good thing because we listen, because we say, because we agree with truth. But Jesus is reminding us to put words into action. In James chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, I believe we even mentioned this last week in the lesson, right? But it bears repeating again. If a brother or sister is in need and you say, be warmed and filled, that's not putting your words into action if you stop there. They need something to be done, not just to be said. I think about as we are encountering people perhaps who have lost loved ones or who are going through really difficult times, there's no greater blessing in terms of our relationship with God than the opportunity we have to go to Him in prayer. But sometimes I'm afraid that our knee-jerk response when someone brings up something that's going on in their lives is, I'll pray for you. That's wonderful. I'm not saying we should stop doing that. But if they have an immediate need, something we can actually do for them, that should come in addition to, I'll pray for you. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 18, John reiterates the sentiment. He says, you are not to love in word or in talk, but in deed and in truth. Jesus comes down from the mountain, telling the people that they need to be the light of the world. And then the light of the world is met by someone who, by every facet of his life, is lost in darkness. I can't imagine being in the position of this leper. But Jesus, He shines a light into his life. Our words speak loudest when we put them into action. Don't get me wrong, words are wonderful. Words can accomplish great things. The Bible is composed of words. But the Bible is composed of words that are meant to be put into action. Our words speak loudest when we put them into action. But not only action. Think about the action that Jesus specifically did. In fact, that's what I ended up putting as the title of this lesson. What did Jesus do in his healing of the leper? The leper approaches and Jesus says, we're supposed to social distance. Let's stay 6 feet away. Now what do you want, right? Oh, you want to be healed. Okay. Oh, you're healed. All right, you're clean. Okay, I'm going to come closer, right? No, that's not what Jesus did. The leper, while still a leper, approaches, kneels down before Jesus, and Jesus reaches out his hand and touches the leper, and only then is he cleansed. You don't touch someone with this disease. Certainly under Jewish law, but even under basic common sense in any realm of the ancient world. Everyone knows this is a bad disease. Everyone knows this is contagious in some sense. They don't understand germs and all those kind of things, but they know enough to stay away from the people. But Jesus stretches out his hand. He touched the untouchable, both literally and also in another sense of that word. Really, when it comes down to it, that was Jesus' whole thing, if you will, while he was on this earth. He constantly was finding ways to touch the untouchable, to reach out to those who no one wanted to reach out to minister to those who everyone was ignoring. And in doing so, with this ginormous crowd behind him who has just heard his teachings, he gives them yet another example of what he's asking them to do. He's asking them to have the same mindset as he stretches out his hand. I've told you all before about the gentleman that we met down in, I guess it would be Central Texas, down south of Fort Worth. We were on that campaign. I told you that there was a man who lived in just this shack, and someone had run him off from the congregation because he wasn't dressed nice enough. I know I've told that story before. I'll be perfectly honest. The idea of sitting down with that man who is probably looked like there were fleas all over his house, probably looked like if I got too close to him, I might, feel like I need to take a hot shower afterward. I don't say that to be mean. I'm just saying that's the mindset we fall into sometimes. There are people we don't want to be around, not because they're committing a sin right now and I don't want to be influenced. No, we don't want to be around just because something about those aren't the people I want to be with, right? We all kind of have that attitude sometimes. But what does Jesus do here? Granted, Jesus knows he can heal a man. I'm not saying if someone has a contagious disease, I need to go up and give them a giant hug and get the disease. But what I am saying is that a lot of times the untouchables aren't untouchables in the sense that there's some kind of physical danger. The untouchables are just the ones we don't want to be around because there's some kind of societal, cultural, personal problem we have. Sometimes it can be a racial thing. I hope that's not the case here. I've never seen that the case here. But that can happen in some congregations. I've seen it happen in some congregations. Sometimes it can be a matter of economics, of wealth or lack of wealth. Both ways, by the way. It's not just the rich who can be snobby toward the poor. The poor can be snobby toward the rich too. Sometimes it's a matter of who you know, who you're connected to, a family that you're connected to. I've been at congregations where if you're not a part of a couple of different families, you're lesser on the totem pole and people don't really care much about you. Again, haven't seen those things here, and I'm thankful for that. My point is, there's always something, I say always, there's usually something that can get in the way of us touching the untouchable. There's always something, for most people, for most of us, that can present a temptation. Oh, I'll let someone else talk to that person. I'll let someone else develop a relationship with them. That's not the example Jesus showed us. In Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 13, Jesus is there having just called Levi. Now he's eating with the tax collectors and the sinners. And the Pharisees can't believe that he's eating with the people that no one in their right mind, no decent person anyway, would be associated with. And Jesus says, I didn't come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repent. The doctor, the physician, doesn't go to the healthy people. Oh, you're healthy. My job's done here. I've done such a good job. No, he goes to the sick. There was a gentleman, may have mentioned it before. He's passed on now. He ran a inner urban ministry. I believe it was somewhere in Georgia, maybe Atlanta, something like that. And it's a place that, to be perfectly frank, the average churchgoer probably would feel pretty uncomfortable going to. Because there were a lot of colorful people in that congregation. There were a lot of former prostitutes. There were a lot of former drug addicts. There were a lot of former drunkards. It can be messy, for lack of a better term, to try and help those people, to try and interact with those people. I don't say those people to try and distance, but in the sense that that's kind of how we think about it, right? I've never really been involved in anything like that. Well, but they're the ones who need our help. Matthew 25 and verse 45. Jesus, as he's concluding this imagery of the sheep and the goats and what makes us one or the other, he says that the ones who are banished from the fold, they're the ones who did not minister, help, encourage the least of these. James chapter 1 and verse 27, we're told, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit who? The orphans and the widows. Remember, in their society, orphans and widows were the two categories of people that were at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of being able to help themselves. They were probably the easiest people to take advantage of. They're not the people who are going to be the biggest givers on Sunday morning. They're not going to be the people who have the most to contribute, most likely, to the congregation as a whole in terms of any kind of monetary or resource or even work-related things a lot of times. Certainly not in their society. But they were the ones who need help. He says later on in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, if you see someone wealthy come in to to your assembly, and then you see someone who is not wealthy come into the assembly, are you going to treat them the same? You treat them differently. Now, I want to make sure we understand there are times where, as I'm sure we're all aware, people present themselves as being in need when really they're not. We have to exercise wisdom in that. I'm not denying that in any way. But it's easy for us to forget, not necessarily in the most direct application of what Jesus taught, but it's easy for us to forget in the more subtle ways that are considered acceptable by society how much we are responsible to reach out to those who are our version of the untouchables. But Jesus built his ministry on reaching out to those that others avoided. Jesus built his ministry on that. That's constantly what he's doing the entire time. I'm not saying he never talked to someone who didn't fit into one of those categories. But we all need Jesus' help. So far be it from us not to reach out to those who need us the most. But thirdly, and this is something very interesting that as I was studying this passage, at first I really didn't grasp the significance of this, and then I was doing some research and read an article that kind of put me on the right track. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Going back to Jesus' response after the man has been healed. He says, go, don't tell anyone, show yourself to the priest. Now, at the most basic level, I'll go ahead and give you the blank to fill in. The most basic level, Jesus is simply following God's law. That's the law that was in place at that time, the Mosaic law. That was what you were supposed to do in the Mosaic law. He's supposed to go to the priest. That will allow him, once the priest has declared him clean, to go back into society. He's supposed to offer the sacrifice. That's to fulfill the law of Moses. So Jesus is encouraging this man to follow God's law. Very admirable, of course. Jesus, throughout his whole life, followed the Mosaic law perfectly. But why did he say don't tell anyone? There's a whole crowd behind him that has just heard his lesson that he delivers on the mountain. They're still present as Jesus performs this miracle and heals this man. But he's telling the man not to tell anyone. It's not like it can be literally kept a secret because a ton of people already know. Sorry, right? So why don't tell anyone? I puzzled over this for a while. But finally, again, through research, I can't take any credit for it. Someone else put me on the right track in their writing. Think about what happens if the man tells a bunch of people on his way to go see the priest. There's no way he's not going to go see the priest because that's his ticket back into society. He's going to see the priest. He might be tempted not to offer the sacrifice, which I think is why Jesus makes sure he says that too. But you're not supposed to tell anybody on your way to go see the priest. Why? How does the Jewish leadership, the priests, the scribes, so forth, how do they feel about Jesus already at this point in his ministry? They don't like him very much, do they? One of the priest's most important roles when it comes to diseases like this is the role of declaring someone clean or unclean. You think if it gets back to the priest before he sees the man who is healed that Jesus is the one who supposedly healed this man, then maybe the priest is going to be biased and he's not really going to want to admit that this actually happened. On the other hand, by telling the man, go straight to the priest, don't make a big deal out of this, and the priest doesn't realize how this happened, the priest is inadvertently going to be proving, without even realizing it, that Jesus did in fact heal a leper. There's a reason why when we are doing, for example, and I don't mean we, us personally, but when people are doing product studies or when people are having peer-reviewed works of literature, of scholarly literature and stuff like that, there's a reason why you have independent studies or independent reviews. It's so you have an unbiased third party to make sure and prove this is actually true, this is actually accurate. That's what Jesus is doing here. The very people who don't like him, who are already trying to set him up for failure, the very people he's taught against in large part throughout the Sermon on the Mount, are now going to be the people who further confirm that he does in fact have miraculous power from God to be able to even heal lepers. And later on, even raised men from the dead. If you remember, they wanted to kill Lazarus because Lazarus was also living proof of what Jesus could do. He simply followed God's law. And yet a lot of times, we want to try and throw our own ideas and our own way of solving a problem into the mix. But the writer of Proverbs, Solomon, in that particular section, he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. We would be tempted to make a big deal out of it. To have him tell all the people what had happened, and then if the priest refuses to declare him clean because he doesn't want to admit what Jesus has done, then make a big deal out of it and say, oh, here's all the people who can say he was clean of the law. Jesus tells them to follow the law. And the proof is right there. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 16, we're told that as we are presenting ourselves to others, as we're willing to, or able rather, to give an account of the hope that is in us, he says we should do that with all good conscience, so that those who might oppose us will be ashamed, because they don't have anything to say. In other words, people can ridicule our faith, people can despise us for what we believe. A lot of times we want to fight back. But in most cases, the right answer is just to keep doing what you know is right. Because if you just keep doing what you know is right, eventually they're going to look foolish. Because they have nothing to accuse you of. That was Paul's strategy the entire time they attacked and persecuted him. Jesus simply follows God's law here. And ultimately, all those who claim to be wise, as Paul talks about in Romans 1:22, look like fools by comparison. God's will is always right. And if we follow it, we will be proven right too. Simply following God's will, even when we think we might know better, even when we think we might know a better way to do something, following God's will always allow us to be proven right. Maybe not in this life. We may not get our big comeuppance, or rather our big, what's the word? We may not be proven right in a public sense in this life. But we will be proven right in the next. These 4 short verses, this, almost we could say, and I hate to put it this way, but we sometimes think of this as just one of the generic healing accounts of Jesus. Doesn't seem like there's much there. But Jesus is giving us an example. Just like he says when he washed the disciples' feet, I've given you an example so that you should do as I have done. Jesus put his words into action, touched the untouchable, and he simply followed God's law. And that is a pattern that you and I can and should follow as well. Lord's invitation is always open. If we can help you this evening, please let us know as we stand and as we sing together.